In this slide cast, we're going to look at the conditions of contract as an overview. You'll recall that the conditions of contract are part of the tender document, which is in turn part of the contract document. The conditions of contract sets out the rights and obligations of both parties. Remember, rights are things they're allowed to do. So the contract gives the contractor the right to go on site and do work. It gives the principal, the client, the right to make sure he's doing it properly, to inspect the works. Obligations, remember the main obligation of the contractor is to build the works as per the contract document in the time allowed in the contract document. The obligation of the principal is to pay him for it. So those are the main obligations, but there's much more. There are many more rights and obligations conferred by the conditions of contract. The conditions of contract also allocate risk. Remember, risk is the things that can go wrong, the things that can stop you from achieving your project objectives. For example, you want to bring it in on time, you want to bring it in on budget, you want to bring it in on to quality. There's lots of things that can happen that stop you from achieving that. For example, bad weather. If there's lots and lots of rain, you're going to be running over time and it's going to cost more. So who pays for it? And that's what the conditions of contract answer. The way that the NZS 3910 works is the party that is most able to manage the risk is usually allocated the responsibility for it. So for example, geotechnical conditions, if you strike rock or something like that. Generally NZS 3910 favours the client paying for any the costs of any bad geotechnical conditions because they have the most control over it. They can do geotechnical investigations before the works start, before the works are designed. On the other hand, if damages to neighbouring properties, that's something that the contractor has most control over because he's the one that's managing all the construction equipment that can do the damage. So you'll see that the responsibility for making sure that doesn't happen goes to the contractor. And if it does happen, the contractor is the one that has to pay for it. So that's what they mean by allocation of risk. The conditions of contract are composed of three parts. The conditions of tendering are the rules of the tendering process. When you're putting together your tender submission, you're referring to the conditions of tendering. It tells you what you need to provide, when you need to provide it, where you need to provide it, where you need to put your submission in. It also tells you what your obligations are when you're doing the tender submission. For example, you are obliged to go on site or make sure that you know what the works are supposed to be involved, for example. So that's what the conditions of tendering are all about. The general and special conditions of contract work together. They're two parts of one contract. The general conditions, two parts of one document. The general condition sets out the general contract rules. It's a generic document. It is NZS 3910 basically. The special conditions modify, add to, provide more information to the statements in the general conditions. The general conditions, you don't write anything in the general conditions. You shouldn't change them. If you want to change them, you do that in the special conditions, and we'll look at that a bit more now. So the general and special conditions are read together. You will see that there's clauses mentioned in the special conditions, and those clauses refer to clauses in the general conditions. So the general conditions are generic statements about insurances, about rights and obligations, everything that you need to know about the roles and obligations of each of the parties. And NZS 3910 is the standard that we use in New Zealand, or most of us use. The special conditions you shouldn't change the general conditions in the general conditions. You shouldn't take NZS 3910 and cross bits out or write bits in. You don't touch that part. If you want to change something in the general conditions, you do it in the special conditions. Okay, it's a very important point. There are two parts to the special conditions are the first schedule to NZS 3910. So if you look at the first schedule, you'll see that it is the special conditions, and it is made up of two parts. Part A is like a form with set clauses and little gaps for you to sort of fill in the details. So it's providing the details that are normally required um, to, um, to provide contract specific details about the general conditions. So you fill in the gaps, you don't change the content. If you want to add more special conditions, if you want to change some parts of the general conditions, that's what Part B is for. So Part B allows you to start writing your own stuff in there. So Part A is, if you look at it in NZS 3910, you'll see that Part A is just fill in the gaps. Part B is you put in whatever you want to put in. Now NZS 3910 is the standard we use for the general conditions of contract. It was prepared by Standards New Zealand, SNZ, and it was prepared by a committee that was composed of people from all parts of the industry. So the committee had representatives from client groups such as Transit New Zealand, such as the local body, local government organisations representing councils, such as developers organisations. It had representatives of the Contractors Federation representing contractors. It had representatives of the Association of Consulting Engineers of New Zealand representing the consultants. It also had people from insurance and banking sectors. So these people all got together and talked about, negotiated an agreement, something that was fair to all, a fair allocation of risk, a fair set of conditions. So NZS 3910 is an agreement, if you like, between the different parts of the industry, what they think is a fair arrangement for a contract. It provides a straightforward, flexible document. It is written in plain English so that it can be understood. Previous versions were written in lawyer talk, so there were, big long sentences with herewithals and whereins, and very hard to read unless you had a law degree. So this is written so that everyone can read it, although the language is still quite difficult. It contains all the essential commercial provisions. You'll recall that one of the elements of a contract is essential elements, that you state what the contract covers. The commercial provisions are the roles and responsibilities, the allocation of risk and stuff like that. So what the NZS 3910 covers is all of the commercial provisions that are required for both parties to know exactly what they're getting themselves into in the contract agreement. So the major advantages are that the provisions are well known and understood. Everyone knows what it is. You don't need to read NZS 3910 from cover to cover every time you do a contract. You know what's in it. So it saves time in interpreting the contract, and everyone knows what's going on. When you're preparing the contract, you don't have to write the general conditions every time. You just say NZS 3910 is the general conditions, everyone knows what you're talking about, and that solved that bit. And it's a fair distribution of risk. As I mentioned before, there was a committee of all the stakeholders and they reached this agreement. So it's a fair agreement. Now, having said that, some councils and other organisations have modified NZS 3910 to give themselves more advantage. So they've moved the risk more towards the contractor. And there's some debate about that. The view is that they're probably resulting in having much higher prices being submitted because they're putting more risk on the contractor. Now off the bottom of this, I don't know if you can see it, it is intended, NZS 3910 is intended for a design bid build strategy. There is a new version of NZS 3910 coming out in the next year or so. It will include provisions that will allow for design and build. It will also include some new insurance provisions as well. But generally, it'll be much the same as this 2003 version that we're studying. Referencing the conditions, in the general conditions are not usually included in the tender document. You don't take NZS 3910, do a cut and paste and stick it in the tender document. It's not required. All you have to do is have a statement like this. General conditions of contract are applicable to the contract are set out in NZS 3, you say what it is, and that's it. That's all you need to do. By referencing it in the tender document, that means that everything that's in NZS 3910 is part of the contract agreement. You don't have to write it all out and put it in the document. If you reference it, it becomes part of the contract agreement. Now when we're looking at specifications, you'll see that we reference other New Zealand standards, and it's the same thing. We reference them and therefore they become part of that contract agreement. The special conditions are usually included because they're specific to the contract, and they vary from contract to contract. So the special conditions are included, so you copy the first schedule out, you fill in the gaps, and you paste that into your document.